The year is 2024, and the combat mechanic in vogue right now is the parry. Every new action game coming out that can possibly implement a parry, and maybe some action games that shouldn't be including a parry, are now bringing this mechanic in as part of their core combat. And so far, unless you're an internet hipster like myself, everyone is pretty much on board with this trend. Gaming journalists, casual gamers, even character action fans, everyone so far is singing the praises of the parry because, at first, the parry is very satisfying on the surface, but one of the goals of this review is not only to discuss the parry as it is implemented in Metal Gear Rising, and why I think Metal Gear Rising's version of the parry is much better than the types of parries we are seeing in something like Sekiro or Resident Evil 4 Remake, but also to discuss what we are losing when we are focusing so much on the parry. Because in my opinion, the fundamentals of melee combat, whether it's in character action games, or in beat 'em ups, or even in fighting games, is the spacing game, where you're trying to defeat your opponent through superior positioning, and the battle of hitboxes, where you're defeating your opponent by getting your higher priority hitboxes to override their lower priority hitboxes. And this comes down to testing the player's knowledge of the fundamental ingredients of the game, like its movement options and like its frame data. This is why in a series like Tekken, the Korean backdash and proper sidestepping are so important.
He's got a nice lead now, 29 seconds left, and he's gonna run for it. Razor Rush, doesn't block the mid. He's backing up. Look at Jackie Tran trying to figure out how am I gonna approach this. Look at this. I'm out of here. 18 seconds left. Clock's winding down. Razor Rush for to represent the counter hit.
Because being able to move and position yourself is fundamental to the melee combat. This is why in Super Smash Bros. Melee, the wave dash mechanic is so important, because that improves the ability to move and space and trade hitboxes. This is why something like Final Fight is such an engaging game, because even though it doesn't have a bunch of flashy combos and specials and meters, Final Fight really hones in on the player's understanding of spacing, on the player's understanding of hitboxes, and also the player's understanding of special states like invulnerability on throws due to iframe. And so in the spectrum of fundamental gameplay, you can see something like Final Fight as being extremely fundamental. It's all about the spacing and the hitboxes. Parries, on the other hand, start to subvert this core concept. And I say start because it really depends on how the parry is implemented. Some parries are much better than other parries. Not all parries are created equal. But anyway, the traditional parry subverts this core concept because spacing no longer matters all that much. As long as you're close enough to get hit, good enough. And then hitbox priority no longer matters as well, because the parry beats all other hitboxes. So it really just comes down to a sense of timing. And the more generous the parry window is, and parry windows are getting bigger and bigger, the less you need to think about even the timing. It is inverting the fundamental combat because it is taking what was once a winning position and turning it into a losing position, and vice versa, turning a losing position into a winning position. In Sekiro, FromSoft had to add the stagger meter because the natural gameplay of constantly blocking attacks, blocking is a losing position traditionally, is unrewarding. The fights would stretch on massively if you had to defeat enemies with traditional strikes. So by adding this meter, they inverted the risk-reward of the combat, where now running and putting yourself directly into oncoming attacks and blocking at the last second is no longer a losing strategy, but the key to winning. And maneuvering around the enemy moves in Sekiro is unnecessary at best and very dangerous at worst, especially because the game barely has hits done and the enemies are rarely interrupted by your attacks when performing their own. A funny example of this is when I first started playing Third Strike after playing a bunch of Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter Alpha. I had learned in Street Fighter 2 and Alpha to uppercut jump-ins, and I got really good at doing anti-airs on jump-ins. Then I started playing Third Strike, and guess what? When someone jumps in on you and you go to uppercut, they can just air parry your uppercut, land, and punish you. So now uppercutting jump-ins was once a winning response is now a losing response. And depending on the game and depending on how well developed the parry system is, and I would say Third Strike has a very well developed parry system, this can then create new gameplay styles and new winning losing scenarios. But if the power of the parry is not properly accounted for, like we're seeing in a lot of modern action games now, it doesn't complement the fundamental combat, it just overrides it completely. It just becomes all about getting the parry. This is why I have such a problem with the parry being introduced in Resident Evil 4 Remake, because they brought in this very overpowered, over-centralizing mechanic that completely negates the spacing of the original game, and then they realized it and were like, oh crap, what do we do? Well, why don't we just remove the spacing game by having zombies charge you so you can't outspace them anymore, and then we'll give you knife durability. And so it takes a game that was once focused on the fundamentals of spacing and hitboxes and turns it into a game that is focused on timing and meter management. And I promise this ties into Metal Gear Rising, because in my opinion, this emphasis on parries in modern action games isn't just a problem with this mechanic in itself, but a symptom of a much larger problem. And the much larger problem with modern action games is the abandonment of the fundamentals of spacing and hitboxes in favor of the new action game formula, which is all about automated tracking, where the game moves you all the way to your enemies for you. It zooms you in, it pushes you in. So there's no more of that really granular spacing where you're just hitting enemies with the very tip of your hitbox, like you'll see in Final Fight or like you'll see in a lot of beat 'em ups. Instead, the game is always pushing you right into that approximate range where you're hitting with the middle of your hitboxes. And then on top of that, it's doing the same with the enemies, where these enemies are also automatically coming in and tracking you, and you can't really get around them. That's one of my big problems with Sekiro, where Sekiro has that dynamic Dark Souls formula. Dark Souls, ironically, is still very faithful to the fundamentals of melee combat, for the most part anyway. But with Sekiro, you can try that all you want, but then you find out, no, just parry. You know, parrying is just so much more effective in that game when it comes to dealing with enemy hitboxes, that trying to dodge around them or move around them, it just doesn't make sense anymore. And the same with Sifu, where it literally locks you out of the freeform spacing game and forces you into these close quarters, Z-targeted interactions where it's all about getting the special states and special dodges based off of the enemy attack. And so what we are seeing is an overall shift away from the more ambiguous freeform melee combat of the past to a more simple, prescribed, solvable melee combat for modern action games. And the reason for that is it is much easier to grasp and understand the modern action game formula versus the past action game formula. Like, you take a new player, you stick them down in Final Fight with a bunch of enemies on screen and say, okay, figure this out. It's gonna take them a lot of time and thought to kind of put together how the game is played, what you need to do, grouping enemies, abusing iframes, hitting them with just the range of your jab. It takes a lot of very specific and situational game knowledge to understand that style of combat, versus you take a game reviewer, a game journalist, you stick them in Sekiro, you stick them in Sifu, and they know, oh, okay, I see the attack coming, I'm supposed to parry that. Oh, I see this attack coming, I'm supposed to dodge it with the up dodge. It's very simple, telegraphed, and prescribed. And at first, it seems like, oh, this is a great way to handle combat. Yeah, this is a great direction for combat to go in. But the problem with that is that once you know the formula, once you know, okay, this is the timing of this parry, it's just kind of done. And that's one of my big problems with Sekiro, where once you know the timing of all the patterns, you know the timing of all the enemy attacks, I mean, what's there left? Just get really reliable at it. You know, there's none of that extra nuance and ambiguity and longevity that you get from a free-form spacing combat system, where if you have really nicely done dynamic enemy AI, the spacing game is never truly solved. It's always an ongoing conversation between yourself and the game. But if you have a very prescribed combat system style, where everyone hones in on each other automatically, And then there's special states and very specific reactions to those special states, like, oh, here comes the attack. Now it's time to parry it. Oh, here comes this type of attack. Okay, instead of parrying it, I dodge it. Then the game's longevity just doesn't hold up over time. The combat system feels nice at first, but it actually kind of punishes you to get good at it. The most interesting time to play Sekiro is the first time. The most fun you will have with this style of combat system is learning it and figuring it out. But once you learn it, what else is there to do? You've done. Okay, we can move on now. And the thing about this is commercially, this style of gameplay design is perfectly viable because the consumption behavior patterns of gamers now is like 1 playthrough, 2 playthroughs, I'm good. We can move on from here. So it's really only going to be the more hardcore, hipster, whatever you want to call us, type of players who expect and want to continue to play and replay the combat system and find that extra depth that are going to ultimately be unsatisfied. But this is not the type of people who also review games and are that influential. So this now sets up perfectly to discuss my thoughts on Metal Gear Rising. Because Metal Gear Rising is one of the very first mainstream character action games to focus so heavily on the parry mechanic. And yes, I know parries have been around for a long time. Knights of the Round actually introduced parries into the arcade. So if you want to find the original Dark Souls formula, check out Knights of the Round. But the thing about it is there's a difference between a gameplay mechanic being kind of introduced in the arcade and being introduced in smaller scale games and then becoming more mainstream popular. Now, these are two different processes, and you can say absolutely that Metal Gear Rising is one of the very first very popular action games to focus in on the parry so much. However, what I really want to emphasize in this review is the way Metal Gear Rising introduces the parry combat into its gameplay is significantly better and more balanced than modern action games. So let's not punish poor Metal Gear Rising for the bad ideas that modern action games have. It's like punishing Nirvana for all the crappy grunge bands that came after them. It's not Nirvana's fault, and obviously Nirvana found something that was very special and interesting, and the bands copying them didn't quite understand that. That's a pretty good analogy for Metal Gear Rising's parry system, where this was built from the ground up from a team that were really putting a lot of thought into how do we bring a parry into a character action game that still maintains, for the most part, the fundamental combat of spacing and hitbox interaction. Well, let's find out. And so let's begin by discussing the actual input command of the parry in Metal Gear Rising. For those who do not know, in Metal Gear Rising, if you want a parry, the command, the way you actually execute a parry in the game, is to press your control stick in the direction of the oncoming attack and then to press light attack button at the same time, and that will activate a parry if there's an active hitbox coming from the enemy. So in order to get a parry to come out, you need to be situationally aware of what is happening. It drives me insane how many reviews I've seen and read that fundamentally misunderstand the brilliance of this style of a parry. So many reviewers have said over and over, oh man, I wish Metal Gear Rising had a button press for the parry. Wouldn't that be more accessible for players to just see an attack coming and to press a button? And the thing is, yes, it is more accessible to not have the parry be an actual command input, to have it instead just be tied to a button with no context sensitivity. No matter where the parry is, no matter what the situation is, if you see it coming, you just press the button. The thing about that is that this suggestion is what is in modern action games now. Modern action games now are all about this. You just have a parry button. And in fact, a lot of them tie the parry to the block. So it's like an OS where you go for the parry. Oh, you're a little bit too early. Well, you blocked it. So the risk of a parry in modern action games is really, really low. The risk of a parry in Metal Gear Rising isn't all that high either, but it has some actual trade-offs. And I think the trade-offs are important to discuss. And I think they're very important to keeping the core fundamental balance of the game intact. Because first off, let's talk about why did Platinum do this in the first place, do you think? Is it that they didn't think of maybe putting a parry button in the game? They're like, we just don't have enough buttons, even though Metal Gear Rising has a free button basically that has no use. Why didn't they think to put a parry button in the game? Or is it that having that directional input has a purpose? The purpose of the directional input is that it tests and rewards situational awareness of your enemies. In order to parry an attack, you need to know where the attack is coming from. Is the attack coming from behind you? Is it in front of you? Is it on your right? Is it on your left? Is it kind of up to the right? Is it kind of up to the left? It is increasing the complexity of being able to execute the parry. You need to know where the enemy is coming from, and the game knows this and tests this. So there's certain enemies like the gorillas where they have certain attacks where they jump into the air, and you need to know where that attack is going to come down, where it's going to land in order to execute the parry. Now, a lot of players are going to complain about this, have complained about this, I am sure. They just would like it if they didn't need to know where the gorilla was and where the gorilla is going to land. You could just know the timing and then parry, and wherever it lands, it doesn't matter. The thing about it is having to factor in that extra dimension of knowing where the attack is coming from opens up the spacing game in a lot of ways and creates ambiguity. Ambiguity you as the player need to navigate and manage. So you got the gorilla up on top of you at the top of the screen. Where is it coming from? His angle of attack is hard to determine. So what you can do is you can run away from the gorilla to create an angle that would make his attack more likely to come from. So if he's above you, you run down the hall, and then you know, okay, I'm going to parry downward because he's going to have to come in from that direction to hit me. It now creates spacing awareness that would have not been there if you could just option select the parry. This happens with a lot of enemy overlap as well. One thing that I really dislike about modern action games and their parry systems is that they remove enemy snowballing because it makes every enemy encounter very discrete. You've got the guy, you've got his timing, you parry his timing, one at a time, discrete, predictable, consistent, reliable, right? That's what people like if they don't want complexity in the gameplay. But what makes Metal Gear Rising really fun and really helps balance out the parry system is, let's say you get surrounded by enemies. You got an enemy behind you, you've got an enemy in front of you, you got an enemy on the left, you got an enemy on the right. What direction do you parry? You're going to have to choose. You're going to have to understand the startup frames for these different enemies. Oh, this guy's coming in from the right first, and then the guy's coming in from the left. You're going to need to start to move around and group enemies up, and it creates that spacing game once again. So the parry is still very powerful. It subverts the spacing game compared to games that don't have a parry, but because they put this directional limitation on the parry, it's still keeping that spacing game more intact than if they remove that. And now you get surrounded by enemies, you just react. Oh, here comes one. Oh, here comes another one. Here comes another one. And so keeping that directional command requirement in Metal Gear Rising, especially because it uses an analog stick, and there's a lot of different ambiguous angles in which you can do the parry, I think that is a really nice way to keep the mechanic balanced. Another thing about the parry mechanic in Metal Gear Rising that I really like is that it is not the end-all be-all. And I've had conversations with people who are really familiar with Metal Gear Rising, and I do know that once you get really good at parrying in Metal Gear Rising, it's still a very powerful technique, and a technique that the game highly encourages. But I also think Platinum sat back and thought about it and thought, well, let's add a little bit more to this, right? Let's not always make the parry the best thing. Let's add in some other options. So other times, parrying can't work at all. Like there's going to be the grab attacks. This is when the enemies turn yellow and they mix up their timings. So if you're just used to doing the parry reflexively over and over and over, well, you're going to get grabbed and you're going to get really beat down because this grab will beat the parry. And the thing about it that's really cool in Metal Gear Rising is that unlike in modern action games, the options are not completely binary because yes, it could get stupid if the game had red flashes, so then you parried, and then when you have yellow flashes, you use defensive offense to dodge them. That would get really stupid, and that would be something modern action games do. But Metal Gear Rising doesn't actually work that way because there are multiple ways to deal with these different scenarios. All the game is doing is just communicating with you what is going to happen, but you can actually navigate them in different ways. For example, the samurai fight, Samuel, you know the game really wants you to parry this guy. The game was like, yes, please parry the man, and he's going to be a very parry-heavy fight, but I found a way to beat him without parrying one single time because Metal Gear Rising keeps the spacing game intact and allows you to use different strategies even in parry scenarios. So for example, in Samuel, I found this pretty busted strategy. The only thing about it is that it kind of takes a bit of time, but if you just keep a sort of mid-range distance from him, that triggers him to do this really fast slashing attack that you're supposed to parry. But you can also offensive dodge around it. So he goes to do the slashing attack, you do the offensive dodge. And the thing about it is the offensive dodge is riskier because if you go for the parry and miss the parry, you still get the block. You don't get really much of an advantage, but you also didn't get hit. You know, it's kind of like a neutral situation. But with the offensive dodge, if you miss it, you're going to get nailed and basically die at higher difficulties. Or you're going to hit it, and then you're going to have some time to get a punishment on the cooldown. And the thing about the game that's really cool is that the enemy AI and enemy programming plays with this dynamic where he's actually sort of waiting for you to be in kind of a funny position, spacing-wise, and then he attacks. And that can kind of create some funny scenarios. But the point is that the game can be tackled in multiple ways because it keeps the spacing game intact. If you want to play a rush down, parry heavy, slash heavy style, that can be accomplished. You can see people doing that against the bosses in the Samuel fight. But if you want to play a more ranged, patient game, that can also work and be pretty viable. And this comes up a lot in the enemy encounters as well, because when you first start playing Metal Gear Rising, you're going to kind of go through this sort of loop. The first part of the loop is when you first start playing the game and you're playing it kind of more like Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden, where you don't really understand the parry system because unlike modern action game parry systems, the parry system of Metal Gear Rising is kind of ambiguous and more tricky to understand. So you're playing it more like Devil May Cry. That's stage one of the loop. And this is where you find that the game feels a little clunky and chunky because it takes a while to get enemy kills. And you can beat a lot of the bosses without parrying, but that also takes more time. And then you get to stage two of the loop where you understand, oh, the parry is like really good. And so then stage two is when you just decide, okay, I'm just going to parry everything in the game. So then you play the game learning to parry everything. And I think this is the stage that a lot of players start to get stuck in, and they think, okay, so this is like a modern action game. You know, all this game is just parrying things, learning the parrying timing, and you can S rank the game on the highest difficulty by doing this. However, when you're doing this and actually playing the game in this manner, I was doing this myself, and I actually began this review ready to really criticize Metal Gear Rising for this very issue. I started to find, because of the balance of the game's parry system, like I said, where it's more ambiguous, it's more situational, it's more challenging, and sometimes parrying does not actually win you the encounter. It just causes a stalemate or could be kind of a tricky strategy. I started to naturally find alternative strategy to always parrying, like the katana guys, for example, where at first I was like, well, I guess I'm forced to parry these guys. I guess that's the play style I want to do. But the problem is when you get 4 katana guys on top of you, and you've got other things attacking you, you know, waiting around for the parries to happen and then hitting the parries, it's doable, but it's not always the easiest way to go about things. I discovered, well, turns out if I just group them up, lure them, hit them with a heavy launcher, and then just air combo them, and then blade mode kill them, that works really reliably and quickly. So you don't have to parry all the time to play the game effectively. And often going back to the old school fundamentals of spacing and hitbox interaction works out perfectly well. So Metal Gear Rising, I really do want to compliment this game where it has a parry system and it has the fun of a parry system, but it also keeps it contained and keeps other viable play options in the balance. And so it's a part of your move set and an important part of your move set, but not the end all be all. And I think that is the best way to bring a parry into a melee combat system. But outside of the parry, there's also some other things about the game I want to discuss. So first of all, let's talk about this game's presentation. I'm a sucker for the Metal Gear series, so I'm already on board for this game's presentation, but I think Platinum really outdid themselves with the presentation of this game, and I still think it looks as good or better than a lot of modern Platinum games now. I mean, it owns Bayonetta 3, first of all. This game looks significantly better than Bayonetta 3, despite being way older of a game. And not only in terms of like the graphical fidelity and all that, but in the actual art direction, Platinum were bringing the heat. I don't know if like Konami were helping out with the art development or the graphics of this game. I'm not exactly sure how that worked, but the game just has such a fantastic vibe and aesthetic. And I do have to shout out Raiden's poncho outfit. This is probably one of my favorite costumes in all of video games. I believe it's an homage to Clint Eastwood in The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. But also, if you live near Mexico, as I do, you know, ponchos are pretty sick looking. So I have my little homage to it. But anyway, presentation-wise, it's not just about the character models and all that fun stuff. It's also about the way the game presents the hits and effects. For example, Blade Mode. Blade Mode just feels so good. It feels so right. I'm not usually a big fan of slow-mos in games because it's cool at first, but then once you do it over and over, like Guilty Gear and stuff like that, it starts to get old to have the constant slow-mos. However, in the case of Metal Gear Rising, I think it really does a good job bringing the slow-mo into the game because you get enemies grouped up together, and then you activate Blade Mode and you get the slow-mo. Then you can strategically slice limbs and do different air combos and stuff like that. I really like the way the Blade Mode feels in the game, and also you can cancel out of it very quickly. I don't think this is something people are aware of because of Zandatsu, and I'll talk about Zandatsu in a minute here, but actually I developed a playstyle that I haven't seen anyone doing, which was I will activate Blade Mode, but instead of always going for the Zandatsu, I will just chop them up in Blade Mode, and then you can either jump or do some other move to cancel right out of Blade Mode and go right back into normal speed. And it gives the game, when you start doing this, a much faster, quicker tempo. And this brings up my least favorite mechanic in Metal Gear Rising by far. I think it is the worst mechanic of the game, even though it looks cool, which is the Zandatsu mechanic. So what the Zandatsu is, I believe, I mean, there's so many mechanics and names in this game, but it's the heart grab mechanic where you slash the little box when you go into Blade Mode and you rip out the heart. This is, again, one of those mechanics where you go through kind of a loop, where when you first discover the mechanic, you're like, this is the sickest thing ever. It's so awesome. You know, you get the enemy weak, you launch them into the air, you activate Blade Mode, you chop the heart, and you can have like the precise slashes with the analog stick. That's really cool. Or you can aim it and use X and Y for vertical, horizontal. All very cool stuff. But the problem with Zandatsu in Loop 2 is you start to realize, okay, this is a little bit too forced of a mechanic. I think this is the most like modern-ish aspect of Metal Gear Rising, because the Zandatsu, not only does it take forever, you know, the animation, okay, the first time you do it, that's cool. The 14th time you do it, yeah, it's cool. But the 500th Zandatsu, the 10,000th one, you watch him do this like 3-second animation over and over and over, especially when you're starting to go for S ranks and you're starting to really fight large groups of enemies, and you do like 6 of them in a row. It's just boom, 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 boom. You know, it has cool dramatic effect, but it just kills the pace of the game. And so eventually it gets really old. And so the Zandatsu animation just takes forever. I really wish they made the animation much faster, or like instantaneous some way, or like it didn't interrupt the gameplay too much. It kills the pace in its current form way too much. Maybe if someone could mod it to be faster, that'd be cool. The second problem with the Zandatsu, though, it's not just the animation. The other problem with the Zandatsu is it's too rewarding. It's too good. The game pushes it a little too much. I think what happened was Platinum came up with this idea and mechanic, and it's really unique and it's really clever, and it's like the standout feature of Metal Gear Rising even to this day, you know, the Blade Mode and all that. And I love the blade mode without the Zandatsu, but with the Zandatsu, it's like, all right, so Rising, you want me to do this over and over again, because not only do I have to watch this animation, but also it's too good not to do, because not only does it heal you, but it also increases your meter back. It gives you full meter again. So what does this mean? This means the game is like, chain this, chain it over and over again. Just watch this animation 10,000 times. Then on top of that, we're going to give you scoring bonuses while you're at it. Because of the Zandatsu, the game wants to push the player into this really uniform style of gameplay of get them in blade mode, chop out their heart, pull their heart, get them in blade mode, chop out their heart, pull their heart, get them in blade mode, chop out their heart, pull their heart. For a while there, I was like, this is such a gimmick. I'm getting really tired of this. They could have helped this in a lot of ways. The first way is, of course, like make the animation much, much faster so you don't have to watch it over and over again. Another thing they could have done, though, is made the Zandatsu less rewarding so that, you didn't have to do it all the time. For example, maybe have the Zandatsu only heal you instead of giving you meter too. So you'd have to like save up for the Zandatsu, or you could have it where it doesn't give you a score bonus or something. So like if they did that where you don't get a score bonus from it, so that when you get to expert level, you're disencouraged from doing it because you want to have faster speed for score or something like that. Or maybe even made it like a negative score bonus, like a health item where you get the Zandatsu but you get penalized for it. That would have worked better as well. But the fact that they emphasize you doing this heart pull animation in every way possible, that is my least favorite thing about the game. But it's also like something they could have easily shifted with just a few tweaks, just a few tweaks that would have gone away. So what I've done is I've developed a play style that avoids the Zandatsu for my own sanity, really. But the thing is at least you can still get S ranks without doing it. At least they were farsighted enough to see that, where if you do no damage encounters, you don't have to actually get the Zandatsus to still get the S rank. So you can still fully S rank the game without ever doing them if you don't want to. And you'll see that in the footage here. If you're wondering, like, am I stupid? Why do I keep going into blade mode and not heart grabbing? It's because I want to increase the pace of the game. So I will go into blade mode and like intentionally miss the hearts. And the nice thing is that even if you're not hitting the Zandatsu hearts, you're still killing them. So you can still chop off their head, chop off their legs, kill them that way. You can even do fun things like chop off their legs and leave them alive and then kill other enemies and then come back and kill their mutilated bodies later. And that actually prevents spawns sometimes. So that can be like an actual viable strategy for enemy management at times. I think the only reason they allow blade mode to kill without getting the Zandatsu was, ironically enough, to like punish you for missing it. But thank God they made that decision so you don't have to do it. So there is kind of a workaround, which I do like, but the biggest flaw with the game is definitely the Zandatsu system. I think it needs to be completely reworked. The other thing about Metal Gear Rising I really want to compliment and talk about that really stood out to me as one of the strongest features of the game is the campaign. So if you've seen my review of Bayonetta 3, and I also feel this way about other Platinum games, is that Platinum tends to have really crappy campaigns, and character action game campaigns have actually gotten worse over time rather than better, because I guess they've decided, you know what, let's turn character action games into a mishmash of random crap. So when you're playing Metal Gear Rising, for the most part, it's combat encounter, nice variety, nice enemy types, and then in higher difficulties, it brings in more enemy types, shifts up the gameplay dynamic in a really fun way. An issue with character action games, of course, is the whole New Game Plus thing. Maybe I'll discuss this in another video, but this is across all character action games where the first playthrough always sucks because you're always like playing in this depowered mode. And then the real game is actually New Game Plus mode. I wish character action games would just drop this RPG mechanic progression system entirely and you just play New Game Plus mode from the beginning, all your moves set. But that's a topic for another video. But anyway, to really play Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, you do need to play through it or use an unlock save to get everything. Play very hard mode, play with the red blade. That's when the game is at its perfect balancing point of the core combat is doing enough damage that you don't have to go for a bunch of parry spams and things like that, but it's still challenging and difficult and scary. So it's a very nice little balance there. But anyway, in terms of the campaign mode, Metal Gear Rising is Platinum's best, easily, hands down. With all the other Platinum games, and I do like Bayonetta 1 more than Metal Gear Rising in terms of the core combat, but when it comes to the campaigns, there's no competition. You know, Bayonetta falls much more into the whole like gimmick sections, platforming sections, lame boss fights, a lot of the times just tanky, boring, scripted boss fights. Getting through Bayonetta 1's campaign can be kind of a slog. And then you unlock the real mode of the game, Angel Slayer. That's when like Bayonetta 1 is like, yes, okay, we're doing it. Unfortunately, Metal Gear Rising does not have an Angel Slayer equivalent, really. It has some pretty cool VR missions, and they are a lot of fun. But the bulk of the game, the meat of the game, is actually the campaign, and it is really good for the most part because it's direct, it's to the point, it gets you into the core gameplay right away. It also integrates the actual level design into the combat. You know, it's not just little arenas. You actually fight them in different areas, and the terrain matters and the spacing matters and everything. That's really awesome. That's just like Ninja Gaiden 2. But it is Platinum, and so we're going to run into the whole spectacle crap that really doesn't hold up well over time. It's funny because there's a lot of mechanics that game reviewers will say have aged poorly, you know, and a lot of these older mechanics that they say aged poorly, I heavily disagree with, like checkpoints, for example. I love checkpoints, and I think they serve a very important function in level design. But one thing that I think I will say has aged poorly is something from the Metal Gear series that Platinum also do a lot, which is basically the interactive cutscene. There are some sections of Metal Gear Rising, not too many, but there are some sections of, okay, just walk and watch this cutscene that you can't skip because it's in-game. Or just walk and let the enemy beat you up and you can't actually do anything about it because it's part of the game. Or there's going to be sections where you run down a hall and you automatically just use your ninja run and run down the hall, and Raiden does his little QTEs and stuff. It's basically Sonic the Hedgehog, you know, where you're just running down the halls. Those sections I don't think hold up really well, and I think the game is best served without them, but this is also really of the time. You even see this in the original Resident Evil 4. The QTEs and all that, they're not overly excessive, but they do wear over time. And similarly, another thing I don't really like about the game is how much button mashing it has you do for no reason, really. Like, there's certain times where you'll get parries, and it's like button mash for the parry. Or there'll be certain sequences, like you're fighting Armstrong, it's like button mash to finish him off and all that. That's very Platinum-y, and that's like my least favorite thing about Platinum is when they have these QTEs and all that. So that would be kind of my least favorite aspect of the game's campaign and all that. But overall, the campaign is very replayable, dense, fun, challenging, and it's always a good sign when you beat a game's campaign and you immediately are like, let's do that again in the next difficulty, which is exactly what I did. I beat the game's campaign on hard. I was like, let's do this on very hard. Then I tried a little bit of Revengeance as well, and I was like, you know, that one's okay, but I think very hard feels a little bit better. And I've actually played through hard mode multiple times, and I actually ended up going through an S ranking all of hard mode. And one thing that I will say that I really like the campaign design of this game, which might be a bit controversial, is I love the checkpoint system of the game. And I actually like how it lets you replay for the ranks in the checkpoint system. Now, if you're going for like some kind of purist run where you want the game to not allow you to do this, I can respect that. But the thing is that one really obnoxious thing about character action game campaigns is that there is no encounter select. This just doesn't exist really. Not even in like Ninja Gaiden and stuff like that. Especially Platinum ones where you want to get S ranks on every enemy encounter. How exactly do you practice this? You have to replay the stage over and over and over to grind out these S rank encounters, which would be mind numbing, versus what the game does allow, which is for you to quick restart each encounter. So, for example, I S ranked all the hard mode encounters and had a great time doing it, by the way. And I was doing it to where if I took even 1% of damage, I would lose the no damage bonus and thus restart the encounter. And so I did actually start to route the encounters almost like you route a shmup stage or you route a beat 'em up stage. And you're getting very precise routing for these encounters, and I was able to do this because of the S rank checkpoint system. And so the way this checkpoint system exists now, I really like. And if it was a choice between having the current system versus not allowing you to restart for the S ranks, I definitely like this current system better. All it really needs is an arcade mode where you can't restart the encounters for ranks, and also it cuts out all the filler stuff between the encounters. So rather than having to do the running sequences and the QTE sequences, you can just go from encounter to encounter in the stage and try to S rank them all. That mode would be really sick, and I think Platinum games and character action games at large all really need a mode like this, because as it stands right now, if you're an arcade style player, you're kind of in a no man's land where the story mode is too bloated and full of filler for you to satisfyingly replay over and over. But then the little extra modes they put at the end, like Angel Slayer or Bloody Palace or VR missions in this, it's just not enough. It doesn't bring in enough level design. You're just fighting in like arenas, and that's cool and everything, but having actual level design is what is really important. And so they need that kind of middle ground between the two, where you're getting the actual levels and boss fights, but without all the filler and exploration and interactive cutscene crap. Just getting right to the meat of the content, and also having like a scoring system in there and a leaderboard system. You know, character action games, they're in this ugly no man's land where they're not RPGs or action RPGs, but they're not arcade beat 'em ups either. They're like this weird in between of the two, and more they're catering to the RPG fans with the progression systems, with the unlocks and all that, and less are they catering to the arcade players with like leaderboards and legit scoring systems and good level design where you don't have to go through walking sections. So I think a nice arcade mode of the campaign would really hit the sweet spot, and that's something I would love to see. And Metal Gear Rising's campaign is closer to that than something like Devil May Cry 5 or Bayonetta 3, but I think there is a lot more room to grow there. So overall, Metal Gear Rising, I love this game. I have 40 hours clocked in for this bad boy just for the review, and it's always a good sign where I go way past where I need to play the game for the review, and I'm like, let's just keep going. You know, I just can't stop playing it. Great pick. The patrons actually selected this review, so shout outs to the patrons. And if you want to help select what I review, you know, the patrons, join the Patreon for that. This game is definitely my second favorite Platinum game. My first favorite is Bayonetta 1, and then a close contender, Metal Gear Rising in the number 2 slot, and then a massive gulf between the rest of the Platinum games. I think this was peak Platinum. You know, this is a Platinum game Kamiya could be proud of. And it's a shame we're probably not going to get many character action games of this quality in the future because of the shifts we're seeing in the action game design and demographics and all that sort of stuff. So a strong recommendation from me. And yes, it has the usual shortcomings of all character action games, where the scoring system is much too limited and easy to cap out. The whole move set weapon unlock system is really stupid. I hate these sort of RPG mechanics in character action games, but I guess they're just baked into the genre at this point, where you need to beat the game to actually then play the game. You know, the New Game Plus mode is actually like the real version of the game, and to get there, you have to slog through the sort of nerfed version of the game. I'm not a huge fan of that. And I do wish there was a more meaty arcade-style mode, but that's a critique that applies to basically all character action games. So it's not really fair to single out MGR specifically for that, but I think that's something I want all character action games to consider for the future. But overall, thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed. Please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Anhold, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Auto-Named, Beam Pit, Bo, Ben, Beetle Dames, Boghog, Borgie22, Chase Palumbo, Chris Yusufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Player Cliff, Climby Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cooksan666, Cook Some Soup, Krusty Boy, Des Audio, Dan Chi, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Dick Jones, Dingo, Disco Stas Leia, DJ420, Praise It, Dr. Bosky, Elias Alonso, Aaron Serafit, FCK, F Deluxe, Friskin, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Full Set, Game Boy Guru, Geese Machine, GPM, Hausu, Jake Ryan, Jacob Velasquez, JLab, JBRPG, Jink Hans, John Kelly, K, K2, K-Horse, Contain, Praise the Boys, Low Casting, Mieshpa, Malaise, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Monroe, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Pedro Perez, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Rafael Trujillo, Raul, Real Skeen, Retro Schmupper, Rolf015, Ryan Bartlett, Scanline City, 7 Overdose, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Serapong, Spiders STG, Steady AI, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Super Funk, SW1335, Tamzarian, Taze, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, Guild Bensta, Toho Rizardi, Tsugumo, 2IU, Twilight EX, Unikoi Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, Zachary Patton, and Zeal.